in London. I hope you can hear us in London.
Very well.
Very good, excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Frank Vogel with the group of 30. Welcome to you. We are on the record. You have got today's report and a press release, and I think a list of who our presenters are. There are really two ground rules, please note. The first is that each of our speakers today is speaking on behalf of the group of 30 and not for their own individual institutions. So please do not ask them questions about their individual institutions. This is a group of 30 event. The second thing is you will understand, I'm sure, that the presenters will much prefer to talk about situations rather than individual firms and individual cases. This is not a press conference to point fingers at anybody, and please bear that in mind. Let me immediately introduce to you the distinguished presenters we have this morning. And let me start over in London with Jean-Claude Trichet, who, as you know, is the former president of the European Central Bank and is the new chairman of the group of 30. And this is his first press conference in that capacity with the G30. And as we're already over in London, let me welcome right next to Mr. Trichet, Sir David Walker. He is a vice chairman of the steering committee that produced today's report. He is the senior advisor to Morgan Stanley International and the former chairman of Morgan Stanley International. And he, of course, was the key author of a very important UK report on governance that came out in 2009. To my immediate left here is William R. Rhodes, who I think many of you know, who is the vice chairman of the steering committee of the G30 that produced the report today. He is the president and CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors, former senior vice chairman of Citi, and most importantly, the author of a book called Banker to the World, which I hope you will all buy immediately after the press conference. To his immediate left is Roger Ferguson. Roger has been the chairman of the steering committee of the group of 30 that has put together this report, major undertaking. He is, as you know, the president and CEO of TYPOU.wmv. He is the former vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. To his immediate left is John Hyman. I could say almost a founding member, almost, of the group of 30, vice chairman of the steering committee, senior advisor of the Financial Stability Institute, and of course a former US controller of the currency. To John's immediate left, very important person for you if you want to follow up on this report, is Stuart McIntosh, who is the executive director of the group of 30 based in Washington. We also have some very distinguished people in our audience here. I'll let Mr. Ferguson talk about the team, but I should mention, of course, Richard Debs, who's sitting in the front row and has been a very distinguished member of the group of 30 for very many years. With that, let me turn immediately to Mr. Trichet to open our press conference. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I have to say that we are delighted to join you from London, both Sir David Walker and myself. I am very pleased to make opening remarks as we release today toward effective governance of financial institutions, which is the last contribution of the group of 30 to the public debate on the extremely important subject of corporate governance in the financial sector. As you know, the G30, which has been set up in 1978, is a private non-profit international body composed of senior representatives of the private and public sectors and academia. And I have to say that we aim to deepen understanding of international economic and financial issues. Our work explores the international repercussions of decisions taken both in the public and in the private sectors. We examine the choices available to market practitioners and policymakers, and where we see the need, we make concrete recommendations for reform. And I have to say that this group has a long history of such recommendations. For instance, we addressed the US and global regulatory reform in the famous Volcker report of 2009. We have tackled, of course, IMF reform, and we have dealt with macro-prudential policy. In May of last year, we have decided in the G30 that it would address the subject of corporate governance in financial institutions, and today's report is the product of that labor. We embarked on the work because weak and ineffective governance of systemically important financial institutions contributed, in our view, to the massive failure of financial sector decision-making that led to the financial crisis. Why did you think that we had to join the debate now? Because we trust that regulators and supervisors cannot alone ensure the stability of financial institutions. There must be continued focus on effective governance within these institutions, as this report underlines. And I would say that the paramount aim of our new report is to promote changes in governance behavior, which demands changing the ways in which people think so that they can successfully induce the specific tailored changes that will enhance governance in their institutions. And I would say that from that standpoint, the culture, the corporate culture, is very, very important. No one should presume that financial institution governance is now fixed. Boards are working harder, supervisors are asking tough questions and preparing for more intensive oversight. Management has become much more attuned to risk management. Shareholders are taking a deeper look into their role in promoting effective governance. But this G30 report makes it clear that further work remains to be done and provides actionable wisdom on the essence of effective governance and what it takes to build and nurture governance systems that work. I have to say that each of the 4 participants in the governance system, boards of directors, management, supervisors, and long-term shareholders, and I will insist on the long-term concept, which goes in the report as some kind of message, needs to reassess their approach to governance and take meaningful steps to make governance stronger. I hope it will be read carefully by you, by members of the financial press, by the financial community, and indeed by everyone who wants to understand better how to make a better governance. Let me now hand over to the chairman of the working group, a G30 trustee and a very old friend, if I may, Roger Ferguson. Please, you have the floor.
Jean-Claude, thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks and that very kind personal introduction. It's certainly a pleasure to see you and Sir David in London, and we're pleased that you could join us today. As you have indicated, today we have gathered to launch the G30's latest report entitled Toward Effective Governance of Financial Institutions. And I want to thank all of you in the room for joining us as well. Today I'm going to provide a brief description of some of the key findings and recommendations in our report, and then we'll open up for comments from some of my colleagues and then for your questions and our answers. The report's central message, as Jean-Claude has referenced, is that much more must be done to strengthen governance in financial services firms. Indeed, we believe that that is sound corporate governance, is absolutely critical for ensuring the stability of the financial system. I want to emphasize that we believe that it is urgent that firms take actions to continue the process of improving corporate governance. Our report is a call to action to those institutions who still need to translate the lessons of the financial crisis into sound governance practice. In the report, we provide a detailed action plan for strengthening corporate governance in the financial services industry. This is the first such plan to be developed by the private sector since the recent financial crisis. The report derives from a project the G30 launched last spring to look at governance of the world's major financial institutions. We conducted an extensive survey of 36 of the largest, most complex financial firms in 16 countries and on 6 continents. We also interviewed industry leaders, regulators, and supervisors, conducting approximately 150 interviews. Through these efforts, we concluded that although progress has been made, there is much more work to be done. To be sure, there have been an unprecedented number of initiatives worldwide to strengthen the regulation of the financial system. Many firms have made significant improvements in their governance practices. Still, we believe that the 4 main participants in the governance system, boards of directors, management, supervisors, and regulators, and long-term shareholders, must strengthen governance in order to fully restore confidence in our financial system. Their efforts should complement the extensive regulatory reform now being implemented. In particular, boards of directors play the pivotal role in governance because they control the 3 factors that ultimately determine a firm's success, namely the choice of strategy, the assessment of risk-taking, and the assurance that the necessary talent is in place, starting with the CEO, to implement the selected strategy. Boards must take a long-term view that encourages long-term value creation in the shareholders' interest. They must ensure that firms are prudent without diminishing their capacity for innovation, and that short-term interest does not drive decision-making. Management certainly has a key role to play in strengthening governance. Good governance requires a strong, well-functioning management team that models and supports the right kind of culture, one that promotes long-term thinking, discipline, and accountability. Management clearly needs to create what we might describe as a no-surprises environment, where issues are elevated quickly, mistakes which do occur are tolerated, but malfeasance is punished, and organizational learning is promoted. Management must also proactively and continuously communicate up to the board, down through the organization, and to regulators, supervisors, and to shareholders. The third actor, supervisors and regulators, are clearly key stakeholders in promoting good governance. But we believe that they must take a broader view of their roles. They need to consider a firm's strategy, people, and culture in making the judgments that their mandate requires. They must recognize that it's not just about quantitative, rule-based regulatory requirements. It's the qualitative is equally important. And finally, to the fourth actor, long-term shareholders. Long-term shareholders can and should contribute meaningfully to effective governance. In particular, they can play an important role in keeping the board and management honest about performance. While no one should depend on them to steer firms away from a future financial crisis, we do believe that shareholders should recognize that they have a vital responsibility to press boards to implement the kinds of approaches that we detail in our report. Our report also addresses several broader issues that are relevant to each of the 4 groups of stakeholders. First, risk governance is clearly of paramount importance at financial services firms. Those accountable for risk policies on the board and within management must be empowered to put the brakes on risk-taking. But they also play a critical role in enabling the firm to conduct well-measured, profitable risk-taking activities that support sustainable success. Second, governance is an ongoing process. It's not a fixed set of guidelines and rules. In the end, what matters most is behaviors. For that reason, we believe there should be a shift from the focus on what might describe as the hardware of governance, the structures and the processes, over to what we could describe as the software, the things that encompass the people, the leadership, the skills, the values. Third, the foundations of good governance are the elements I've just mentioned above: people, leadership, and values, which shape and drive corporate culture. The values of integrity, independence of thought, and respect for the views of others are essential components of a sound culture. Senior managers need to be very active in promoting a strong culture by example, The tone at the top is crucial. Boards of directors should be vigilant in seeing that management sets an example that promotes very high standards of corporate behavior. The report makes the point that ultimately the key to changing the way people behave is to change the way they think. We recognize that this is not easy, but it is doable. Changing culture and values, and thus behavior, is an ongoing process, and it's an organic process. It will happen given the right amount of encouragement and support from leadership, but it will not happen overnight. This is indeed the most important, but also the most difficult part of the governance puzzle that we address in the report. We urge financial firms to maintain their focus on this critical staff. We hope that our report will help shape the thinking about effective governance and promote real change in governance practices. The result will be increased confidence and stability in our financial system. So thank you very much for your attention. Before we move forward, I want to make sure that I take this opportunity to thank my three extremely hardworking vice chairs, John Hyman, who we've already met, Bill Rhodes, and Sir David Walker in London. All three worked diligently over many months to shape and sculpt this report and assure its timely release today. I'd also want to thank Tom Woodard and Mark Watson and their team from Tapestry Networks. They traversed the globe many times to complete the research for this report, and we appreciate their dedication. And the Group of 30 also thanks Bill Slick and the Ernst & Young organization for providing invaluable support to the project and for helping to make it a success. Now I'd like to ask Sir David and then John and then Bill in order to make some opening comments and then join me in answering any questions that you may have about the report. And obviously John Claude is also still with us. So back to you, Sir David in London, for any opening remarks that you may have.
Thank you, Roger. Well, you and Jean-Claude have made, I think, all the key points, but I just want to amplify on two very important issues: the dynamic of the boardroom and the oversight of risk. As you and Jean-Claude indicated earlier, there's been huge focus on tougher regulatory requirements for capital, liquidity, leverage, but that alone is not sufficient. It needs to be complemented by improvement in the quality of board decision-taking. After all, it's boards and managements that are responsible for setting strategic direction and for ensuring sustainable performance by their entities, of course within the established regulatory framework. Regulation involves hard, specific rules, but effective governance depends to a far greater extent on much more qualitative and behavioural factors. Let me just give a few examples. The composition of the board and its relationship with the executive, the style and quality of leadership by the chairman, the capability and readiness of outside board members to contribute in a value-additive way through well-informed board discussion and challenge. And, as emphasised already, the values and culture decided by the board and how the values and culture are embedded in the business. On board oversight of risk, the second of the two areas I particularly want to emphasise, an appropriate process of challenge in the boardroom or around the board table is nowhere more important than in relation to risk strategy. Some form of financial risk is embedded in every financial industry product, and settling the entity's risk appetite is a critical ingredient in strategy. The strategy of a financial institution is basically a financial risk strategy and is therefore a key responsibility for the whole board. What we draw out in the report from this is two major requirements. First, for a board-level risk committee that looks forward to risks today and tomorrow and in the future, preferably separately from the audit committee. Frequently these have been combined in the past. And secondly, a chief risk officer reporting to the risk committee who has substantial independence from business units and the executive and who has direct access to the risk committee. And I note that before the crisis, 3 years ago, only a minority of those institutions that we've surveyed in this exercise had either of these two requirements in place. That's to say, a board-level risk committee or an independent CRO who meets the specification we describe in this report. I'll stop there, Roger, and stand ready to help with questions later.
Great. Thank you much, Sir David. And I think we now go to John.
Thank you very much, Roger. Following on David, in this report, we underscore the crucial relationship between supervisors and financial institutions. And let me just give a few key points on this. You'll find it all in the report itself between pages 61 and 67. Number one, good supervision is overly complex for financial institutions and is exceptionally difficult. You must prevent, you do not wish to repeat, I would say, the overtly relaxed supervision of the kind we saw in the past in some countries and some institutions. But at the same time, you cannot have overly intrusive supervision that attempts to micromanage the institution. To do this kind of job well, it demands the willingness by authorities to invest in top-level people with excellent training. And you cannot have good supervision on the cheap. Yep. Supervisors have to understand the overall business of the firm and develop a sophisticated appreciation of how corporate governance works. The supervisors need to develop a trust-based relationship with the senior executives and the directors of the institution. They need to ensure boards and managements govern effectively by setting realistic expectations and adjusting regulatory guidance accordingly. And finally, as you see in this report, we are advocating a significant improvement in the relationship between supervisors, management, and boards that can build confidence and trust in the effective governance of financial institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bill?
Thank you, Roger. I think my colleagues have made most of the points. I just have a few that I would like to add. I know you're all anxious to get to the question and answer. I think it's fair to say, coming out of the Great Recession, public trust in financial institutions has been a matter of some concern. And I think it's very important that the public understand some of the improvements that have been made and those that are being made. As Roger noted, I think integrity, values, culture, reputation are absolutely key. And here the actions of senior management working with boards, I think, are crucial. And a couple of other points I'd like to add here. I think the boards and senior management have the responsibility for shaping the culture of a company. We believe that management working with the board should articulate fundamental principles or values of culture that foster acceptance. The messages here need to be consistent, and consistency is a key here. You just don't react to a crisis and then kind of go back to old ways or move on. You must be consistent over a longer period of time with your culture, your values, and your risk management. And I think this requires discipline, not only on the part of management, but also on the part of boards. I think very importantly is for the boards to take a long-term view along with management of what they want to achieve, rather than looking just at the short term, which is often the drive of shareholders and management. So I think looking at what we've been talking about on a consistent long-term basis is really a key going forward. And I think that also, when we take a look at the various risks senior management has to face and the board working together, one of the greatest risks, if not the greatest risk of all, is reputational risk. And we wanted to emphasize that. And so I think that all of this needs to be worked into a firm's strategy and culture on a consistent basis. You cannot let complacency set in just because you're out of one crisis and things look good. You must be consistent, long-term values over time. Thank you.
Good. Phil, thank you very much. And Frank, back to you to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Yes, if any of you have got questions, we'll start. And please just introduce yourself at the same time and wait for the microphone so that our colleagues in London can hear you. Let's start over here, and then we will get around. Thank you very much.
Hi, Tom Berkeley from Institutional Investor Magazine. Hearing your comments and reading through the summary here.
Wait, 1 second. Can you hear in London the question?
Yes,
Yes, you can. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, Tom. I just didn't know if the mic was working.
All the recommendations sound eminently sensible, but I'm sort of struck that 5 years after the crisis, you feel the need to express such simple basics as risk managers need to be empowered, culture is important, management should effectively do their jobs. If that's the case, doesn't that suggest that the problems are still pretty fundamental, and is this kind of exhortation really going to do anything?
Let me take that, if I could, as the chair. First, thank you for recognizing that the recommendation is eminently sensible. I think that's very important. There are a couple of reasons why I think this is timely. One is that progress has been made. One can look around and see that more boards have people with expertise in financial services. More boards probably now have risk committees. CROs, chief risk officers, have probably moved up a little bit in many organizations. Having said all of that, I think the main point to make here is that is simply not enough. And the point of this report is to say that good corporate governance in financial services is a complex system. All parts of it have to work. Right? And so it's not just, one of the points that we make is it's not just the boards and what they do, but also how management interacts with boards. Also making sure that regulators, as they think about new regulation, quantitative regulation, also take into account some of these softer issues around corporate governance. And certainly long-term shareholders have an obligation to hold boards and management accountable for these types of activities. So, one of the major messages is progress has been made, but more must be done. The second message is that it really is a system. It's not enough just to simply say we've done it because we have, now a risk committee. It's really a question of how the software works. So back to issues around value and culture, for example. And so I think the main message here is some has been done, more needs to be done, and as Bill indicated, complacency, I think, is really one of the big enemies that one has to worry about. And so that's why this report is just quite timely, and I hope, and we intend to work really hard to make sure that this is well received across many, many institutions around the world to drive ongoing improvements in behavior.
Just a brief word. I think implementation here is key. When you say 5 years, you've got to be consistent on your implementation. And this is one of the key messages of this report, flowing on to Roger's comments. Thank you.
Maybe we'll go on because I think we'll get some of these questions come back. Let's go to the second row and get the microphone over there. Thank you very much, John.
Hi, I'm John Gapper with the Financial Times. The report is very specific, in fact surprisingly specific, about splitting the role of chairman and chief executive. It says there's a compelling logic for splitting the two. It says that it's strongly encouraged. It says that a combined role may be acceptable if there's a lead or senior independent director, but it doesn't sound very enthusiastic about it. Goldman Sachs has just been through this process and refused to split its chairman and chief executive. I think JP Morgan has a combined chairman and chief executive. What are you actually calling on these organisations to do?
Maybe we could go to Sir David Walker in London to start off the answer there. And I just remind you, just for anybody who came late, all the speakers are speaking on behalf of the group of 30 today, not their individual institutions. Yes, Sir David, sorry.
John Gapper won't be surprised that I'm put up to answer this question. I think we take the view on the basis of the research that's been done that, in fact, the United States is an outlier in this respect. The trend around the world, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, continental Europe, is toward a separation of roles. And when we say in the report, we think there's a logic for this, those of us who worked on it and have worked in this field in the past feel that the role of leading the board and the board agenda and ensuring there is interactive discussion and challenge in the boardroom is a major role and is separate from that of running the company. However, which is the role of the chief executive, however, I think many of us feel extremely reluctant to be over-prescriptive in this or in any other area, and I think the view that we would take is that while we have a preference for the separation of roles, which is what's being reflected in practice increasingly around the world, and increasingly, I note, required by supervisors and regulators, there may be cases where there is a senior independent director or lead director who's capable of standing in the chairman's shoes, so to speak, in the event of need. That's not our preference, but we don't want to be too prescriptive about this.
Let's move on, and then, yes, sir, please. And then maybe others will comment later. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Pierre de Gasquet from the French newspaper Les Echos. On the subject of compensation, I was wondering why the report is not more specific on compensation practices, which are a key factor in improving governance. And do you think the Dodd-Frank Act has improved the situation in the US?
Let me speak to the compensation. We spent a great deal of time thinking about how to address the issue of compensation and came to the conclusion that there was already a very good set of guiding principles out there from the Financial Stability Board. And I'm referring to the principles from 2009. And so we, after a great deal of discussion, concluded that in lieu of simply incorporating those or rewriting them, that we'd incorporate them, if you will, by reference. And so we feel, and I have in front of me the FSB principles for sound compensation practices, that really does sort of cover the waterfront. And so we recognize the importance of compensation in good corporate governance, decided not to repeat good work that had already been done, but would certainly get you to address any questions or issues that you might have by reading the FSB report.
Does that cover all of your questions? Because you had something on Dodd-Frank, but you think that's covered?
Maybe Mr. Rose? Dodd-Frank? No.
Well, as you know, we're in the process of implementing Dodd-Frank, and it will be implemented. There will be some changes probably in how it's actually implemented by the regulators, because there's still work to be done there, but it will be implemented. One of the things I think that is important is that over time, we really need to see cooperation and coordination across the whole system in implementing all of these standards. That was the idea of Basel III and the Financial Stability Board, and in fact has been embraced by the G20. So I think that's a longer-term goal to do that. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about this report, and a number, as both Jean-Claude Trichet and Roger have emphasized, is the number of major institutions worldwide that was covered. In the past, there's tendency to be European, American. We covered everything, Far East, Chinese banks, etc. So I think this is a far-reaching coverage, the most, frankly, that I've ever seen.
Yes, sir. Yes, we're going to Frank Rowe because we have new author of a book on Olympus, which happened to have a governance problem, although it wasn't a financial institution. But please, sir.
Good morning. My name is Hajime Mitsuru. I'm a columnist of Japan's Sankei News. I have a question on the role of board member, director of the board of financial institutions. Given the complexity of the needs of optimizing the needs of different conflicted stakeholders, what will be the new standard of fiduciary duty that would hold the board members accountable that sits on the financial institution? In the simple corporation, there will be two poles, duty of care and duty of loyalty to the shareholders. But in the case of financial institution, what do you think we should enhance that kind of fiduciary duty, or should we create a new fiduciary duty? And if it's so, if we should create, do you think it should be a universal rule, given that systemic risk is cross-border?
Well, let me try to start the answer, because it's almost impossible to answer it completely. And let me start with the last part, cross-border. And that is one of the difficulties that the financial system, the global financial system, faces these days, because the regulatory authorities in different countries take different approaches to the same, effectively the same problem. I mean, the coordination process can descend into box ticking, protectionism, and the like. And this is something that we all have to try to fight against, the whole of the various nations involved in this enterprise. So international cooperation, international coordination, even though there have been big steps in the direction of improving it, still has a long way to go. And Bill, you may want to add to that because you've seen so much. The international cooperation.
Yes, well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really key, because what we don't want to end up here is with more regulatory arbitrage than we started off with. And I think this report is going to be help in getting that coordination, because we set down a series of thoughts which we think are really key to good corporate governance going forward. And this is an area, frankly, that has not been spoken to that much. The first comment was that, well, here we are 5 years later, which is true. But I think that you can never overestimate the importance of corporate governance, and to be trying to do it on a consistent basis in a coordinated way over time. And this is really why we put this report together.
And your first part of your question is, how do we improve the quality of directors' responsibility? I may not be saying that elegant thing. So that, right, how do we make it work better than it does today? And I think part of the answer to that comes from the supervisors, who are there to look. The supervisor's job is to oversee what the organization is doing and making sure that it meets the rules and regulations. That's the simple part. The harder part, as we stress in our report, is understanding the philosophy, the culture, the values of an individual financial institution. And to that degree, that's where the supervisors have a very important one. And they have been upgrading their game. I think there's no question about it, but it's got a long way to go.
Yes, please. You had a question. Yes, so please let's get the microphone just here. Thank you.
Nick Parasky with the Regulatory Risk Report. I'm just wondering how you expect the principles in the report to be effectuated. For example, do you expect that any of the content guideline will be incorporated by supranational bodies, for example, such as the Basel Committee, which does have guidelines for banks, and or the FSB, for example? And I'd also be interested in how you expect regulators to change the behaviour maybe that they've had in the past to ensure that they are implemented.
Jean-Claude may want to speak to some of those issues, questions of how this report might be implemented, and also, indeed, what regulators might do to change going forward, and then others may want to comment. So, Jean-Claude, if you have any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you indeed, Roger. Let me say that, as was already said by John, we have in the report very precise indication on what could possibly improve the relationship between the supervisors and the financial institutions. And in this respect, of course, again, we are very much, I take your the word which we already used, you know, the hardware and the software. We are very much in the software in this respect, where we think that a lot of things can be improved in the culture, the corporate culture, the values, as has been said particularly by Bill. And as said John, it is the same at the level of the interaction between the supervisors themselves and the corporate businesses in question, the financial institutions. So I would say that there are a lot of recommendations, a lot of suggestions that would be incorporated in the overall functioning of the system, which is of extreme complexity, of course. And so I have to say that a lot of our own suggestions Roger, seems to me to go in the direction of enriching and improving the functioning of the system as a whole, including, of course, the interaction with the supervisors.
Sir David, I think you had an additional comment.
Thank you. Well, it relates to this last question and the rather specific previous question that John Hyman answered, which relates to the issue whether in relation to these businesses, the board members of financial service businesses should have a higher level of personal liability. And the answer, I think we considered this briefly in the group, the answer to which I think we would came, is that there's a real danger that if you raise the bar for the standard of the personal liability of board members, you might not have board members for these entities. What I think is important, and this segues into the last question, the latest question, is there are a lot of things that the supervisor and the regulator can do to ensure better performance. One is a thing which is being certainly explored and implemented in some degree in the UK, and I know is being looked at elsewhere, is the pre-qualification of board members for major financial service entities, some sort of bar or test before they're authorised by the supervisor to become board members. Secondly, after the event, appraisal by the supervisor of the performance of the board is, I think, an important part of the disciplining of the board process. So those are, I think, relevant considerations in answer to that earlier question.
You also had a specific question about the FSB and other things, and I'll ask Stuart McIntosh to respond to that.
Yes, you asked whether how we hope to take it forward and see the standards and the principles that we're enumerating in the report implemented. We will be feeding this into the FSB thematic review on risk governance, and we hope to also present and communicate the results of the report to all members of the FSB and the G20, and indeed much wider than that.
Let me just add to what David said about the board. The board has to evaluate itself. That is a responsibility. They have to do a self-evaluation of their effectiveness, and that then there's an oversight to that. Then the supervisor can look at what the board thinks of itself, and then tries to see if that's realistic or not.
I would just add to the list, we also plan to discuss this report with the Basel Committee. So I think, with the various groups that we mentioned, I think they will find this report very interesting, and we hope to have an interchange. As you know, on the board, among other things, we have the heads of those institutions on the board of the group of 30.
Are there any additional questions? Yes, please, Mr. Moore.
It seems like with many of the recommendations...
Could you just introduce yourself so that our colleagues at London don't get...
Michael Moore from Bloomberg News. It seems like with many of the recommendations you propose here, someone in the board of directors, someone in the room would feel the effects of making those changes. But if you're an outside shareholder, or if you're an outside group like the G30 or like the press, what should outside shareholders be looking for as signs of progress that these changes are being implemented if they're not in the boardroom?
That's a very good question, because some of these are indeed subtle. But first, obviously, the question is the degree to which the hardware has visibly changed. And I think it has changed in many cases, not every case. Secondly, I think you'd very much expect to hear a slightly different tone at the top, where one would expect CEOs and others to very much be in a place where they're talking about reasonable risk-taking and how they manage it. I think you'll probably find over time that the community of chief risk officers will become much more visible as well, as one of the results of this kind of activity. Clearly, from the standpoint of long-term shareholders, what long-term shareholders are looking for, I suspect, may well be, I don't know if this is doable, but potentially over time less volatility in earnings, perhaps. And that's a long-term issue. But certainly, we should be, all of us, looking to see in reports, annual reports and other things, whether or not the focus is really on long-term performance as well as quarterly earnings per share movement. So one of the other tests, if you will, is are we hearing from financial institutions that they are talking about long-term performance, long-term value creation for shareholders? Because as Jean-Claude emphasized, one of the outcomes of this, I think, would be a greater focus on long-term sustainable performance. So I think there are 2 or 3 different kinds of things, and much of it really boils down to the way financial services firms communicate about their own performance, the kinds of things that we hear and understand about culture, what it is that the CEO is saying, and I think to some degree, greater visibility around the whole risk process.
Yes, please, we have a question here in the front. From Athens. Please, introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is TYPOU.wmv. I'm with Greek American News Agency. I would like to ask, how would you describe, would you describe that an effective governance is now connected or has a turn to a more ethical or moral direction?
Has it or should it? Sorry. Question.
Would you describe?
Well, I think ethical and moral is obviously a strong value judgment, but clearly a place that we have come down that we believe is new and important is a focus on culture and value. Now, whether or not that becomes more moral is I think, an individual judgment from your own perspective what morality is. But the issue ultimately is, are we thinking, and our financial services firms really putting a greater emphasis on the kind of value and culture that we've been talking about that has a focus on the long term, for example. I believe that is a way to start to get to your question. I don't know if I would describe it as moral or ethical. I'd certainly say it raises the importance of values as part of this whole system of corporate governance. And in the past, I would argue, not all financial services firms would have put a great deal of weight on the question of how they would describe their culture and value the way that we're encouraging them to talk about it.
I would just add here, and I think we've mentioned this before, the importance of reputation risk, values, culture, and also transparency. And I think that fits into all of this, and also to the previous question. I think it's all really tied in together.
If I may, Roger, I would say among these values, as was already said, integrity and transparency, as was just said, are fundamental. And we are close to the ethical question, if I may. Integrity, transparency.
Maybe one final question, if there is one. Yes, oh, please. Also from Athens. Good.
Also from Athens, yeah. My name is Thanos Dimatis, and I'm correspondent here in New York and Washington, D.C. from the Skype of Greece. I would like to ask you, do you believe that the way that financial institutions, banks, the way that they have been working all the previous time, all the previous years, is a source of the crisis that we live today, and particularly in the case of Greece? Do you believe that the recapitalization of the Greek banks after the Greek debt restructure should be taken under specific conditions, and what these conditions are? Mostly about the role of the state, about the role of the official state in the managing of the banks in Greece, etc. Thank you.
Well, I think you put your finger on one of the keys, perhaps maybe the major key to recovery in growth in Greece, which is the state of the Greek banking system. And I think the recapitalization of the Greek banks, I think, is key. The Greek banks themselves were not the cause of the problem, as you know, and your colleague here better than I do. And because of the lack of confidence, they lost a third of their deposits, etc. But I think they are a key to the recovery of growth in Greece. So I think their recapitalization is really key. I think that I am a believer that once this happens, you will see the Greek banking system very active in supporting the private sector and other issues in Greece. But it's a very key point, no doubt, to the recovery of Greece. As I said, I think maybe the key point.
Sorry, you had an additional question, and then, well, both of you did, and then we'll wrap up.
I don't know
Coming
if
out of time.
Mr. the President, Jean-Claude Trichet, could accept my question about how does he see the Greek banking system after the Greek debt restructure, and if he could make any assessment of that. I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I think, though, that that's really going quite a long way from the report.
Yeah.
I don't know if any gentlemen want to talk about that, but I don't think they're quite on that. But we have, so please excuse me. Yes, we have.
Yeah, I would like to ask Mr. Trichet.
If I may,
please,
we really
yes.
are, if I may, we really are here to discuss the report and not individual cases or country cases as well as financial institutions cases. But I would say that I am in full agreement with what Bill just said, only to confirm that this is essential for the prosperity of Greece to have a functioning financial sector, a financial banking sector.
Yes, please. The last question. Yes.
All right. I would like to ask Mr. Trichet about his experience at the ECB. Which are the key elements that need to be changed or to be avoided or to be addressed in terms of an effective governance, according to the report?
Fortunately, you said according to the report. So the same question could be asked to the previous Vice President of the Federal Reserve, the previous controller of the currency. We are three
I'm from
previous
Europe, so.
financial authority. No, let me only say that the financial system and, by way of consequence, the global real economy has proved a degree of fragility that we have to correct. And our report is a contribution to improving the full system. And I think that, as said Roger very eloquently, it is timely because it's work in progress. We have done a lot, but a lot remains to be done. And that's the idea of the report.
Let me follow up on what Jean-Claude has said, because I think it seems like a good time to close the press conference. But let me just repeat Jean-Claude's message, which is the essence of the report is, while much has been done, much remains to be done, and that this is a matter of some urgency. We believe that good corporate governance, ongoing improvements in corporate governance are a critical part of creating and maintaining strong financial institutions and therefore a strong and stable financial system globally. Much has been done, much needs to be done. And the second point is that corporate governance is not simply about simple things that one can measure, though they are important, risk committees, etc. But it's a whole and fully integrated system that includes important players, board of directors, management, supervisors and regulators, long-term investors, and importantly has a number of hard and soft factors, and all of that must be taken into consideration. So we thank you very much for your attention, thank you very much for your interesting and provocative questions, and we look forward to having you follow the developments of the Group of 30 going forward. Thank you very much.